All right, so our topic for today is comparison of adjectives and ablative comparison. Again, you'll want to read through the information given about this topic. Once again, this in first glance can seem not confusing, but it seems like there's a lot to learn. But in reality, since we don't do English into Latin, it's not as difficult because basically if we know the word and have a sense of whether it's positive, comparative, or superlative, we'll do quite fine on this topic, as you'll see. So as you can see here, as we'll point out, that if you have the base form, in most cases it's going to follow the first or second declension ending. And then the comparative form is going to have IOR as its suffix or ending. And then the isimus, isima, isimum is going to have the superlative form. So really just kind of memorizing the endings in bold and then being able to recognize the base form, which a dictionary will give you, really makes this topic very manageable. As you'll see with a couple times through the chapter and the examples, I feel confident that this will be a successful chapter for you. So please take a look at this. I will come back and try to refer to it in the exercises themselves. Let me go ahead and pull up our Latin declensions. Again, if you don't have these memorized in your head, as I've said many times, you really need to have this next to you as you're working your way through the chapter content. This is absolutely essential for any understanding of Latin. I'll open this up here so we can reference it when need be. And then we're going to go back to our chapter and talk about the Latin. So once again, you'll have to read through some of the vocabulary, a lot of which, of course, is used in this chapter. So I'm going to presuppose you can do that on your own time. And let's look at this one right here. So here we have another quote by Cicero. Of course, Cicero wrote an essay, De Senectute, on old age. We think of words like senility or senile. So this means old age, senectus. And then literally senectus is more loquacious. In fact, our word loquacious, you can see the word right here comes directly from the Latin. But here we have the IOR, which tells us that we need the comparative form because that is the rule for Latin. So if we go back, here's our comparative IOR. And there's different ways to translate it, as your book points out, but in most cases we're just going to use more as our translations. If we go back to the example, I went too far there. Old age is more garrulous, if we follow this. Now, what does that mean? Well, for Cicero, language and reason and wisdom are the trifecta of what makes human beings human. In particular, the wisdom of a public official, being able to use words or rhetoric to express wisdom in a Socratic manner in order to enliven and elevate the body politic. And so that's sort of the anthropology behind this here. But in terms of the Latin, we can simply translate it as old age is more garrulous. Interesting nowadays, garrulous or being talkative, I don't know if it has a negative connotation, but it certainly suggests a kind of long-windedness. Of course, it just depends on what kind of words one is using. There's many things we could say about this in the history of humanistic thought, but we'll kind of leave it at that. All right, so that one's pretty straightforward. Tua concilia omnia nobis clariore sunt quam lux. This one's also by Cicero fairly straightforward, especially when we recognize that concilia is a neuter noun in the plural. So here's our neuter nouns. And so concilia, the singular is concilium, but here we need the plural form of that. And so how do we know that it's in the plural form? Well, we know because we know the vocabulary, as we just pointed out, but also the main verb is in the plural, which is another index. To, of course, means your. So your plans. And then English is probably going to like the verb here. So literally are more clear, or in this case, you could also say clearer using just er. To us. In fact, I left out the omnia here. So all your plans. So tua concilia omni. All your plans are clearer to us than light. That is, than the light of day. So as your chapter points out, I can't remember exactly where it is, but quam is often used for comparison, and we can translate it as then. So again, as you read this chapter in advance of doing the exercises, you'll see a brief explanation of how to use quam in this particular case. Here's a good example, similar to the one we just had, then. So quam means then with the comparative, then with the comparative. You see it functions somewhat similarly, but with the superlative as well, as you'll see. But how to translate it can be a little bit different. All right, so that one's pretty straightforward. These sentences tend to be fairly short and sweet. What else could we say about this one? Lux is third declension, nominative plural, or excuse me, nominative singular. That's just basic vocabulary. To us, that's going to take the nobis, and that just probably needs to be memorized as a dative indirect object. Okay, moving on to number 3. Quidem can mean, this is where if you have to kind of mess around sometimes. If I go to Whitaker's Words, for example, and I type this word, oops, I can type here. So you can see that this can mean certain, somebody, one, or something. So you have to kind of mess around with the translation to see which one fits the context. So if we go back to the example here, Remedia also is a neuter noun because remedium is, just to kind of give you a little bit of confidence here. It's a lot of course, learning a language, like most things, is knowing the vocabulary. Same with writing, of course. To be a good writer, you have to have vocabulary. So you can see remedium is the nominative singular. Now, we don't have the singular because we have remedia, which here you can see it turns that into the plural. So we go back to our example, is certain remedies are graver than the dangers themselves. So this one's interesting because we have two neuter nouns in the plural, remedia and pericula, which are both neuter nouns. In fact, I think, no, it doesn't have that here, but if you look at the vocabulary, you'll see that pericula is also nominative plural because periculum is the singular form of that. So this one really just requires knowing the vocabulary from earlier chapters. So we have Seneca here, who was a Stoic. So certain remedies are graver than the dangers themselves. Of course, grave means serious, but also means, in this case, will put you in the grave. Stoicism, of course, which we cannot go into, especially on this virtual format, is this idea of mind over body, that the body has certain needs which are distinct from the mind. And oftentimes, there are doctors and there are doctors, as they say. And so sometimes, especially back then, the doctors would often do more harm than good, if for no other reason because of infection, which has been greatly reduced in contemporary medicine. So there's our comparison here, gravior, and then our graver than, so quam using then, so that one's pretty straightforward. Quatuor eodei virus fortissimos atque montissimos rei publicae a me vocavi. All right, so this one's a little bit longer, so that makes it a little bit more challenging. Time expressions probably just need to be memorized. That means on that day. So if you could just make a note card, anytime you see eodei, sometimes you'll see this form in the Latin New Testament Vulgate. Probably just needs to be memorized, but it is in the ablative. This is second declension, ablative singular. Of course, DA is fifth declension. So if we look at our declension charts, you can see there's the DA on that day. And then, of course, the AO is going back to the second declension. But probably just needs to be memorized if you're not 100% confident with cases, and especially ablative in this case. So on that day, and then we can put a little marker. Now here we have viros fortissimos, and then amantissimos. So we have os, which should tell us that we have second declension accusative plural. So this is the direct object, second declension accusative plural. There's our os. So we know that this is the direct object, so we've got to keep that in mind. So on that day, literally, now here we have the isimus, isima, isimum. So here we need to be able to recognize that this is the superlative. Because going back to the chapter, as you can see, it's fairly easy to recognize and hence learn with just a little bit of practice. So here is our isimus, isima, isimum, which tells us we need to use the superlative form. So for example, strongest or biggest. And of course, sometimes we can use, excuse me, sometimes we can use most as well. You just have to, as with so much else, experiment with the translation to see which one you like best. So once we recognize that, we could say on that day, the bravest and most loving men of the republic to me I called. So here's our subject and verb all the way at the end, vocavi, isti, in the perfect form. So on that day, I called the bravest and most loving men of the republic to me. So of course, the context of this is Cicero was an apologist of the Roman Republic, and so he's sort of calling out those who want to defend the republic from the perceived tyranny of Julius Caesar, which in one sense, to be more accurate, was just the end of the republic. But nevertheless, that's the context for that. So this one's pretty straightforward in terms of. So this one also could be most. Here they're saying amans rei publicae could be patriotic, so we could also translate that as on that day I called the bravest and most patriotic men to me. Would be another, but literally of the republic. All right, number 5. Qui means whoever, so, or he who. We often don't talk like that except in more formal, perhaps literary English, but here we have our verb, which this of course means, this is the past tense, accepted. So whoever willingly, here's our present participle going back to an earlier chapter, so liebens. Again, if you're not sure about these things, ultimately, of course, you need to be confident. So looking these things up is probably the way to go. But here's our verbal participle, and willing is probably the way to translate this here. It doesn't mean cheerful or glad or pleased. That would be an awkward translation. So we're going to say willing. Of course, that's where we get our word liberty. In fact, here's a good example because they have the positive form of the adjective And here they actually give you the comparative form with IOR, and then here are the superlative forms. Of course, Latin has gender in the nouns. That's why you see some of the different endings. We'll go back to the examples that, so imperia means power. That's where we get imperium. It isn't the plural. Of course, power is more than one sort of thing or entity or essence. So that's why the word itself is in the plural. But whoever willingly accepts power avoids, here we go, the most acerbic part of servitude. Now, I kept that a little bit literal. What does acerbic mean? The parts that we don't like about power. The necessity of power. The necessity of taxes, the necessity of rulers who seemingly are involved in their own struggles between freedom and power. And so we'll keep it literal in terms of acerbic. You can also look this up in terms of how you might want to translate it. So, but I'm just going to keep it acerbic. So whoever willingly has accepted power avoids, so this is avoids, the most acerbic part. So partem is third declension accusative singular. So there's our em. So the most acerbic part. So there's our accusative direct object. And then of servitude, because that is third declension genitive singular. So there's our east ending here, because servitude is third declension. And again, if you can give yourself a little bit of confidence by putting these words up, and rather in the wheel up, and the Whitaker's words rather. Okay. All right. Let's move on to number 6. So we had this beware of Greeks bearing gifts. So donation. Once again, it's another neuter noun in the plural because donum, is the singular. So we have to be able to recognize that this is in the plural. Here's our isima, which tells us it's superlative. So literally the most pleasant gifts is how you would translate that. The most pleasant gifts, as they say. So here's a place marker in terms of indirect speech that we have to probably memorize, as they say, are always those which the author himself makes dear. Now here, this is a quote by Ovid, so he's talking about the author here, in terms of that an author is going to be most pleased with his or her own work and the praise and the rewards that one receives from satisfaction with one's own hard work than outward praises seems to be at least part of the idea here. So the most pleasant gifts, as they say, are always those, literally always those, are always those which. So here's a relative pronoun that probably has to be just memorized. Are always those which the author himself makes dear. Okay. So the tricky part here is going to get that phrasing, are always those which just may need to be memorized if it's not clear. Number 7, beatos, of course, means happy. So beatitude is happiness, which happiness is an interesting topic to say the least. Happiness generally means a complete life, getting all the different forces and drives and competing conflicts in our lives somehow on the same page or not fighting with each other. Generally speaking, that's happiness. I'm a little bit sick right now, so you could say, why do sick people feel, if not unhappy, they certainly would call themselves happy, because my body is in a state that is not congenial with the aspirations of my mind. And so that generally creates some feelings of displeasure, which we often associate with unhappiness. But going back to the Latin here, so beatus sapiens quae vir forum vitat et superba limina potentiorum givium. So we're going to look up some of the vocab here. Like limina is the threshold, liminality, subliminal, eliminate, preliminary. You can see this is very literary. It's some kind of boundary or threshold. So we got to keep this literary vocabulary in mind for our translation. So we go back here, is a happy and wise man avoids the forum, and literally the arrogant thresholds of more powerful citizens. So superba means arrogant, threshold, we said that's how they're suggesting we translate it. What does that even mean? Well, the first part's pretty clear. A happy and wise man avoids the forum. Literally, in the arrogant machinations, the arrogant power displays, the arrogant appearances is kind of the sense of it, of powerful citizens, because power is an appearance. People appear to have power because people think they do, but the reality is, because it's very temporary, that's sort of what power is. It doesn't have anything related to happiness and wisdom. Happiness and wisdom are more eternal, according to Horace. Of course, not just him, but most thinking people. Whereas power is very temporary, and it contributes to the bread and circuses of public life. And you can see the disconnection between happiness and power, which Horace writes about time and again. So just going over this one more time. A happy and wise man avoids the forum. It's pretty straightforward. There's our accusative direct object of second declension, us eo and the arrogant thresholds of more powerful citizens. Okay, so here is our comparative here, because we have the IOR, civium. So if we look at our endings here, you can see there's our genitive endings. And then civium, because citizens is third declension. There's our genitive plural, civium. Okay, let's see here. Yes, little footnotes. Sometimes in my experience in teaching Latin, the genitive sometimes can be a little bit tricky, just because we tend to use apostrophe S a lot. But if you can get in the habit of saying of, I think it just matches the Latin a little bit better. Number octo, quid est turpius? Turpius means stupid, like turpitude. What is more stupid than to be deceived by another? So here's our present perfect passive infinitive, which we saw earlier. So that means to be deceived. Again, if you're unsure about these things, you have to take the time and write these things out. So there's our present passive infinitive. So that means to be. You can see here that this, to be mocked, to be ridiculed, to be spoken of mockingly, to be fooled, to be duped, clearly doesn't mean to be used for sexual pleasure. That's not what Cicero, so we rule that one out. But you have to kind of decide which one you're going to use here. So to be deceived, since that's what they're giving here in the italics, so let's go with that one. So what is more stupid than to be deceived by another? Of course, what does he mean here? Well, I think if somebody's lying to you, if somebody's telling you something that is trivial, you can tell if somebody's serious. I mean, I teach younger students during the daytime, and I tell them all the time that you can win a championship having fun. You can't do much of anything being silly. So if one is silly or not taking life seriously, you're going to get exposed on many levels, and it's just hard to do anything if you're just goofing off all the time. So that's something we all have to learn. And so, but it's no different morally, according to Cicero, is you can tell if somebody is serious about moral conversations or moral values, or if somebody just wants to take the easy road and says, well, that's your opinion, that kind of stuff. So at any rate, so that one's, I think, also fairly easy to explain. more Cicero, kind of in the same vein. For what is more stupid? So there's our. Now, a lot of times we said that IOR is the comparative form, but this one is the IUS. Again, if we're not sure about these things, we just have to take the time out and use our tools. And so you can see here, this is the comparative. So you just have to look up these words to get a little confidence. So for what is more stupid than to hold uncertain, so probably uncertain things. So for what is more stupid than to hold, or literally to hold uncertain things for certain things, falsehoods for truths. So that's a nice one. Again, not too complex. For what is more stupid than, so we talked about how quam means then, literally to have or to hold or to think. Uncertain for certains, but we have to kind of understand he's talking about uncertain ideas, uncertain notions for true notions, false ones for true ones. So you can experiment a little bit with that as well. All right, so we tend to do 10 of these. So I thought, just focus on this one. This one's kind of interesting. So you don't need to worry about 10, 11, or 13. So, multi putant res bellices graviores esse quam res urbanes, sed haec sententia mutanda es nam multi res urbae sunt graviores clariosque quam bellicae. So again, we got a longer one here, but we got to break it apart using the punctuation, for example. So, putative means to think in English. So that's where we get comes right from the Latin. So many think. So again, if we're not sure about this, we have to take our time. Everybody's in a hurry, I know that, but that's not how learning happens. So we have to look this up here. So putant, puto, putare, putavi, putatus, to think, believe, suppose, hold, reckon, estimate, value, clear up, settle. So you could use any of these: think, believe, suppose, hold. I don't know about reckon. That sounds too calculating for Cicero's language. So I'd go with one of the first, probably first two, but all four of these are sensible. One thing about translation, you have to get a sense of the style of the author. Great authors like Cicero or Shakespeare, they don't use a dictionary, they make the dictionary. So you got to be careful of just using any word in a dictionary. That's a very sloppy way to use language. So it has to fit the style and the tone and the context and of the language. So probably the first couple would work here. Ultimately, of course, you can't translate it because it's Latin. So sort of keep that in mind as well. Multi putant res bellices graviores esse quam res urbanes. So many think. And many think what? Literally wars. Literally things of wars. I guess so. Many think that wars or things of wars, elements of wars, are more serious than I guess civil matters. So let's go with matters. So many think that matters of wars are more serious than civil matters, literally urbane things. And you can see the challenge here, and that's why it's number 12 at the end. Perhaps in the translation we would say of, and of course that changes that from first declension accusative plural to a genitive of form, which it's one of those things where you got to realize you're just trying to smooth out the reading here. But many think that matters of war are more serious than matters of the state. So there again, I changed my translation again just as I read it again. But this opinion is to be changed, but this sentiment ought to be changed. This is where we get the word mutation or mutant. For there are many things, literally of the city. that are more serious and more, literally more clear than those of war. What does he mean by that? Is that according to Cicero, and he's not alone in this way of thinking, that the reason there are wars is because civil discourse and civic virtues break down. And so civil discourse and civic virtues, in one sense, are the barricades against man's violent nature. So if we spend too much time preparing for defense, as some people tend to think, that's fair enough, but what are we doing to ensure the peace? That requires an entirely different education, entirely different way of thinking. And so Cicero is in that line of moralists who, probably rightly so, confuse Caesar and God, or man and animal, or man and the gods, however you want to look at it. And they spend too much time, they're too preoccupied with wars and power and pleasure. And it's not surprising that human beings have very little at their disposal, seemingly, to ward off the forces from below. Let's put that in our translation one more time. Many think matters of war to be more serious than matters of the state, but this sentiment ought to be changed, for there are many, so we have to say there are many, T-H-E-R-E, for there are many things of the state that are more serious and more clear, in other words, clear in terms of how we ought to act and live, than those of war. Now, urbane also means kind of having a cosmopolitan disposition, doesn't mean state. So if we say, let's put this in our Whitaker's words just to give us some alternative, of the city. So maybe that's the way we want to do it, of the city. All right, so let's take a look at the longer passage, which is, I want to say this is fairly close to the original. I can't remember, to be honest with you. So let me check here. Oops, I can type here. Every Sunday during preview, we speak with musicians about their recordings. So, yeah, it looks to be fairly close. I'm not going to go through it, but it almost seems to be the exact same, which Caesar's original Latin is actually very accessible. I mean, again, you need the vocab, but you can get a dictionary for that. But he was a great stylist. Of course, that was part of his rhetoric, and how his language and power, among other things, reinforced one another. He spoke and acted as if he always had everything under control. In a lot of cases, he did. And so he just had a clear vision of what Rome was and what Rome was becoming, namely an empire. And of course, that contributed to his many political and military successes. Now, of course, the people, there's always a losing side, so to speak. They're on the wrong side of history. Sometimes things change, and there was a lot of resentment against Caesar, but he was a tyrant, but not a tyrant in the sense of Hitler. In one sense, Caesar was on the right side of history, and those in the Senate, including Cicero, were on the wrong side of history, that Rome was no longer a republic, but an empire. And so a lot of Cicero's writings, give insight into how Rome had changed. Anyway, so this is, they give you a lot of vocab over here, so you definitely want to read down here. This continues on the next page, of course. This is, of course, Gaul for many, many years had been kind of a thorn, and oftentimes even more than that, to Rome. Even Pompey the Great had tried to quell, these border skirmishes and threats to Roman political integrity, but to no avail. And so Caesar, as he did in so many cases, was the first to not only conquer the Gauls, but to reestablish Roman power in the civilized world, so to speak. Anyway, that's the context of this. Gallia, of course, Gallia is modern day France. So Gaul, we would translate it Gaul, but it's modern day France. So Gaul, literally as a whole or is as a whole is often the translation for this. Sometimes even Gaul altogether is divided into three parts. Of course, he's talking about the different tribes. And of course, even this idea of division and Caesar's quest and success and unity is he's writing. Remember, he's sending back these letters to the Roman Senate, which itself is very divided. Rome is in the midst of a civil war. And so this language needs to be read in terms of how Caesar himself brings unity to the dispersion of tribes and power in this part of the world as a kind of representation of how he is doing and will do the same for Rome. So there's a little bit of propaganda in here as well, although this is, a lot of historical accuracy as well. Anyway, let's go back to the Latin, I guess. Gaul as a whole is divided into three parts. One of which, again, if you're not comfortable with the genitive, as we said earlier, it probably just needs to be memorized. But this is first declension genitive plural. So if you look at, so there's your Rome. So one of which, genitive means of. One of which, literally the Belgae inhabit. And of course, this is modern day Belgium. So inhabit, I-N-H-A-B-I-T. So Gaul as a whole is divided into three parts, one of which the Belgae inhabit. The other, in other words, the other part, the Aquitani, and that's, we can keep that as the Aquitani. That was the name of the group. The third of which, so the third part, so there's three. You got the Belgae, the Aquitani, and the Celtae are the three competing tribes for this region, so to speak. The other, the Aquitani. The third, who literally of their own tongue, they are called the Celts, in our tongue, the Gauls. So this one, just kind of smooth that out again here, is another Aquitani. A third, who call themselves in their own tongue the Celts. They are called in our tongue, so nostre linguae, the Gauls. So that, which makes this last part a little bit tricky, is that epilantor is doing double duty for these two clauses. All these languages, so maybe we could translate that as languages as well. Linguistics, lingua, means tongue in Latin. All these languages, institutions, laws differ from each other. So he's saying that, of course, that not only the Romans, of course, but the Gauls and the Belgae and the Aquitani speak a different language. They have different institutions. They have different laws. Well, it should come as no surprise that they're not on the same page politically and existentially. And then here, which makes this one a little bit tricky, is we got to recognize that the river is the subject. This one's kind of a unique ending, but because we know this is second declension accusative plural, here's a preposition, and then all the other ones really don't fit. So we have to recognize that this is the subject. So the river Garumna divides the Gauls from the Aquitina, and the river Garumna divides the Matrona and the Sequana from the Belgae. And again, these are all, I think these are rivers. So we have three rivers here, the Garumna, the Matrona, and the Sequana. And then we have the three tribes. We have the Gauls, the Gallos here, and then we have the Belgis or the Belgae. And then literally Of all of these, or among all of these, the strongest are the Belgae. Could also be the bravest. So, of all of these, so orum is second declension, genitive plural. Omnium is third declension, genitive plural. So if we look at our charts here, oops. So there's our orum, and then there's our for the omnium. Here we have an interesting ending here because Belgae is AE, but the adjective requires second declension. So fortissimi, are the Belgae. So of all of these, the Belgae are the bravest. All right, so that one's pretty straightforward. The tricky part of this one is recognizing. Let me see. Let me make sure. Matrona, because they don't give us that vocabulary. Let's see. See, this one doesn't even tell us. So it's not wife. I think it's the river. Let me see. Let me look at the back of the book here. So if you look in the vocabulary at the back, let's see if they give us that. On page 527. Nope, they don't give it to us either. So at any rate, you can easily find an English translation of the first part of this. I'm just, I gotta have it here. No. Oh yeah, right here. Okay, my bad. I thought it'd be here. So yeah, so the Garumna is the Garonne River, and then the Matrona is the Marne River, and the Sequana, I guess, is the Sina River and as well. Let's see, where's the map? Do they have a map here? No. So wherever map 2 is, not sure where map 2 is, but because I'm feeling a little under the weather. So, but if you look in your book, apparently see map 2, you'll have a better description of this language. So we go over that one sentence one more time, is that the Garonne River divides the Gauls from the Aquitani. And then we can say that the Marne River divides the Gauls from the Belgians.